All right, welcome everyone. We'll let folks trickle in here into the webinar as we get started. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Yousef Munayyer, and along with my colleague Christian Davenport, we co-direct the Transnational Repression Project. And we're delighted to be able to bring you this second webinar in our spring webinar series focused on transnational repression. Today's topic is transnational repression and non-state actors. Earlier on this spring, we had a conversation about the Transnational Repression Project and a conceptual overview of transnational repression along with Dana Moss and Rebecca Cordell in our first webinar. And this is the second conversation that we're hosting. We're delighted to have a group of experts here with us today to talk us through this topic. Before we get into today's content, though, just a couple of things that I wanted to draw everyone's attention to. A recording of our previous webinar for anyone who missed it is available online on our website and on YouTube. Please do check that out. And also, you'll know on our website, we have a couple of resources which we have added on to since our last webinar, including expanding our literature maps, mapping out the literature on transnational repression. And we've also announced a workshop for emerging scholars. So for those who are working on the issue of transnational repression and want to share your research and ideas and look for feedback from others working in this field, that's something we'd be happy to arrange. So please do check that out if you're interested and let us know so we can help make that happen. With that, we'll move into our conversation today on transnational repression and non-state actors. We're really happy to have with us three folks who work on this issue from a few different directions, and I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they will present. So they'll all provide introductory remarks, and then we'll have time for questions and discussion afterwards. So presenting first will be Rasha Abdul-Rahim, who is a strategist and an independent expert on technology, human rights, and social justice issues. She's also currently the interim executive director of People vs. Big Tech, a movement of over 140 organizations in Europe fighting to overturn predatory business models of big tech corporations. Prior to that, Rasha spent 15 years at Amnesty International in various roles and was the director of Amnesty Tech from 2020 to 2024, where she oversaw global research, campaigning, advocacy, and policy development on various big tech issues, including big tech accountability, unlawful targeted surveillance, and establishing new programs on AI and human rights. She also co-led the award-winning Pegasus project in collaboration with Forbidden Stories, a groundbreaking global investigation which exposed the scale of abuse of Pegasus spyware. And it's on those issues that Rasha will be focusing her comments today. After that, we'll hear from John Heathershaw, who's professor of international relations at the University of Exeter, and his research addresses conflict, security, and development in authoritarian political environments, especially in Central Asia. And he's the co-author of Dictators Without Borders, the UK's kleptocracy problem, and also Indulging Kleptocracy, new in 2025. And I think his comments will be focused on work in that from that publication. After that, we'll hear from Edward Lemon, who's research assistant professor at the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University in Washington, D.C. And his research focuses on the global dynamics of authoritarianism, in particular transnational repression. And he is the co-author of the forthcoming book, Backlash: China's Struggle for Influence in Central Asia. And his work on transnational repression has been published in a number of different journals, including Globalizations the Journal of Democracy, and the European Journal of International Security. So we're really glad to have you all. And at this stage, I want to turn it over to Rasha to begin with her introductory remarks.
Thank you so much, Yousef, and thank you for having me also on this webinar. I'm really pleased to be speaking on a panel of such esteemed colleagues. And just to say at the outset, although the vast majority of the work that I'll be talking about was work that I did at Amnesty International, I do not speak for Amnesty International, having left the organization now. So what I'm going to talk about is the use of spyware as a tool of transnational repression. Then I'm going to focus in on the Pegasus project, one of probably the most important projects I've worked on in my career, and as a sort of case study of sort of the pervasiveness of spyware as a tool of repression. And then I'll end on hopefully a positive note of where we're going with this industry. So I started working on tech issues around 2012, and back then there was a pervasive lack of transparency, particularly when it came to the use of targeted digital surveillance and the role of the private sector in facilitating that surveillance. There was sort of a handful of organizations doing research on this issue. So the Citizen Lab being one of the sort of pioneers of research on this issue. Then Amnesty and Human Rights Watch also did a bunch of research. But basically from 2015 onwards, there was very little to go by, really. It was very difficult to identify these cases, who was making these products, who was buying them, who they were being used against. But what we did determine from the research that we did is that obviously they were a very, very powerful tool for surveillance used to monitor, intimidate, and control dissidents, and particularly if those dissidents were abroad. So there are various examples of NSO groups, Pegasus spyware being used by countries like Saudi Arabia and UAE to surveil dissidents overseas. Same with Morocco as well, surveilling of Moroccan dissidents in France, for example. So it was used as a tool of sort of political repression, but also was very, very effective in cracking down on freedom of expression. The second trend was the use of spyware as a tool of sort of psychological intimidation. So spyware data that was collected was often used to harass, blackmail, and threaten individuals abroad, for example, by sending threatening messages that prove intimate knowledge of people's activities, or using the spyware to collect compromising material and then threaten to expose it. Third is the sort of chilling effect of the use of spyware. So even the mere threat of the use of spyware had a massive silencing effect on people, which essentially caused the shrinking of the civic space, of the activist space of sort of political discourse. And the sort of fourth trend was the fact that this spyware wasn't just used against specific targets, like activists or political opponents. It was also used against their families and associates of targets. One very prominent example is the case of Jamal Khashoggi. One of his associates, Omar Abdelaziz, who lives in Canada, was spied on using NSO spyware, and also his ex-wife and fiance were targeted with the spyware, and in fact had to go live in hiding, and their family and friends didn't really want to communicate with them because they knew that they were sort of being surveilled. So it's very much a global issue, but it was very much sort of under the radar back then. And at the same time as a lack of transparency of these tools, there was a huge rise of the industry itself. In response to end encryption, apps like Signal and WhatsApp, they were being used in state-sponsored attacks, but also by providers of services for states and security agencies, and also sort of intermediary entities that were hired by the state to conduct surveillance on their behalf, which are even more difficult to detect. And the focus on the phones was because of the amount of information that they provided, but also other devices like computers and laptops were targeted. And importantly, the lack of regulation on the use and export of this type of technology really allowed it to flourish in such a way that we saw when we exposed the Pegasus project. So just super quickly, how it works. This spyware can be used in one-click attacks, whereby the device is infected when the user clicks on a compromised link, which is sent via text or email or SMS or whatever it may be on social media platforms, and zero-click attacks, which are terrifying in the sense that the device is infected without the user even interacting with it or doing anything. And once the spyware is on the device, it can track the person's location, it can access conversations, emails, contacts, microphone, pretty much everything. And it's very difficult to detect on mobile phones because it's effective in the sense that it's sort of undetectable to the normal person, and even to some experts. It's difficult to perform forensics on mobile phones. So for a long time, it was very difficult to understand who was being targeted and how. And there were also a lack of public tools for consensual mobile forensics until the Pegasus project, which I'm going to focus on now. So, as I said at the beginning, it was very difficult to understand the scale of. Oops, sorry, I went ahead. Of the spyware industry. And so we knew that the few hard-won insights that civil society journalists and researchers were able to obtain regarding NSO Group and a handful of other surveillance companies like Hacking Team and Finfisher, for example, they were just the tip of the iceberg. And so we obtained a major leak of 50,000 phone numbers of potential surveillance targets of a spyware called Pegasus, which is a highly invasive spyware produced by Israeli spyware company NSO Group. And we, on that basis, partnered with Forbidden Stories, which is a French media organization, to sort of uncover and investigate who those targets were. It was a collaborative investigation, which involved 80 journalists from 17 media organizations in 10 countries. And it basically showed us that the scale and the breadth of the use of this spyware was completely out of control. It was destabilizing to national security, and it was threatening to people's human rights and even their physical safety. And so who were the sort of targets of this spyware? Well, it wasn't just terrorists and criminal gangs, as NSO Group often claimed and actually still claims today. It was lawyers, activists, politicians, journalists, business executives from all over the world. Over 200 journalists. Sorry, this BBC slide is wrong. Over 200 journalists from 20 different countries, hundreds of politicians, at least 14 heads of state, and really it showed that no one is safe when it comes to the use of this spyware. No matter where you're based, you can be targeted and your entire life sort of laid bare by whoever wants to know what you're doing and what you're saying and where you're going. And just to say also that from the leaked data and the investigations that we carried out, it was identified that NSO had clients in at least 11 countries, and more have come to light since the Pegasus project. But from Azerbaijan to India to Mexico, Saudi Arabia, Togo, UAE, the list goes on and on. And what really this project showed, that NSO Group spyware is a weapon of choice for repressive governments seeking to silence journalists and attack activists and really crush dissent. And because it's such an unaccountable industry, it sort of runs on also through in an unaccountable sphere of state practice, which allows it to sort of continue unhindered and with absolute impunity in some cases. As well as the investigation that we carried out, the Amnesty International Security Lab, which is, I should have explained this at the beginning. Amnesty International Security Lab is basically a group of technologists and essentially ethical hackers who can carry out digital forensics on devices to understand whether they've been compromised with spyware. They also produced a tool called the Mobile Verification Toolkit, which is completely open source and is available to anybody who's got the know-how to use it. But it allows people who need to have a bit of technical know-how to check if their phone is compromised with spyware. And so that was used by lots of different organizations. It was also used by the French authorities, by the US authorities, by the EU, the UN, many, many others. And the use of the tool actually uncovered even more cases after the Pegasus project, including of Palestinian human rights defenders that were hacked with Pegasus spyware, and also a prominent Belgian journalist covering Rwanda, and many, many more. Sorry, sticky buttons. So what was the sort of impact of the Pegasus project? So I won't go through all of the examples listed on the slide, but one of the most significant, I'll highlight two actually very significant outcomes. One is that the US Department of Commerce placed NSO Group on its entity list for malicious cyber activity. So what that means is that the Department of Commerce determined that NSO Group posed a significant risk of being or becoming involved in activities contrary to the national security or foreign policy interests of the United States. And it also meant that US entities couldn't do business with NSO Group, and NSO Group couldn't do business with US entities. So that's a really sort of strong action taken by the US administration, and it seems to still be in place now, for now. There were also several high-profile investigations in Mexico, in the EU, in India, in France, Belgium, Hungary. But one very significant impact that I'd like to highlight is Apple and Meta took NSO Group took legal action against NSO Group because basically NSO Group exploited vulnerabilities in their platforms in order to be able to sort of spy on people. And only a few weeks ago, Meta won $167 million in punitive damages over an attack that downloaded spyware on more than 1,400 WhatsApp users' phones, which is really, really significant. And there is an ongoing Apple case as well, which hopefully will result in the same. Now, having said all of that, it is still a huge problem, and it's not just NSO Group that is producing this type of spyware. While I was at Amnesty, we also did another investigation in 2023 called Predator Files. I won't go through that in too much detail because I know I'm up for time, nearly at time. But basically, this was a European company that was producing highly invasive spyware. It marketed itself as a European company that was subject to the strictest EU regulations, yet was able to evade those very regulations to export spyware to not just what we like to call sort of repressive regimes, but also democratic states. One example is Spain, and Greece that were using these tools to spy on activists and political dissidents at home and abroad. So although some action has been taken after the Pegasus project, much more needs to be done, particularly when it comes to regulating the export of these types of spyware technologies. And so what does the future hold? So as I say, NSO Group is one company of many that's producing and exporting these types of technologies. These attacks against political dissidents, journalists, lawyers, activists, etc., continue because of the impunity that these sorts of companies have enjoyed, and also that their customers have enjoyed. Although tools such as the mobile verification tool that this Amnesty Security Lab produced can help expose those threats, technical solutions are not enough. So really what's desperately needed is regulation to curb the sales and exports of these types of technologies. In some cases, a ban on highly invasive spyware that cannot be used in line with human rights and the rule of law. And also meaningful accountability for misuse, which is starting to happen against NSO Group. And NSO Group is nearly sort of going bankrupt. And so we need to see more of that. And I will stop it there. And just to flag that if you want to learn more about the Pegasus project, there's a book that was written by our partners in Forbidden Stories. And there's also a very cool podcast that you can listen to. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rasha, for that very thorough breakdown. I know that you have to leave us a little bit early, so I thought maybe we'd have an opportunity now for any questions, either from other panelists here or those who are joining us on this webinar in the audience, that maybe we can have you address. As those populate, I'll start with one. I mean, you noted that NSO Group is kind of the more notorious group, let's say, that we've learned a lot about, and they've started to get a little bit more scrutiny. But there must be so many different actors in this industry, and it's probably something that is only going to grow exponentially over time, I would imagine. Do we have a sense of what this ecosystem looks like, how many different actors we're talking about, and sort of what is their nature? Are they similar to NSOs, the NSO Group? Are they different? What does that universe look like?
That's a very, very good question. The answer is yes and no. Yes, in the sense that we know that we know of companies. For example, another quite notorious spyware company is Celebrite, which is another Israeli company. Perhaps not a surprise that many of these companies are Israeli companies, though not all of them, obviously. The UAE also has a burgeoning industry of spyware. Intellexa, which is the company that was involved in the Predator Files investigation, is a European, has European entities. One of the things that was very fascinating about the investigation on NSO Group is just how opaque their corporate structure is. And this doesn't just apply to NSO Group, it applies to pretty much any spyware company that you look into. They have subsidiaries in many, many different jurisdictions. It's unclear who's sort of at the top. It's unclear where the money is going. They have multiple accounts. They have offshore accounts. And that's all very deliberately done to make it as difficult as possible to investigate, and to make it as difficult as possible to hold perpetrators to account. So there are amazing organizations like Citizen Lab and Amnesty and Access Now and journalists as well that are sort of trying to map this. But the corporate structures are extremely, extremely complex, extremely diffuse. So it's very, very difficult to sort of keep track of the ecosystem.
Thank you for that, Rasha. And we also have a question that comes in from an anonymous attendee. How should academic institutions respond when state-linked spyware is used to monitor scholars or students?
So I would say, well, the first responsible thing to do is to do everything you can to not subject yourself to spyware, though that's, with zero-click attacks, that's extremely, extremely difficult. But, always make sure that operating systems are up to date, that you make sure that you know what you're clicking on, that, take all of the sort of security precautions that you can. I think it's really important to document them and to flag such cases. both to sort of public interest organizations and journalists, etc., to sort of expose the scale, continue to expose the scale and the pervasiveness of the problem. But I also think it's really important to see how to achieve accountability as well. So be that through legal action, but also through flagging to relevant decision makers in your jurisdictions, to sort of push for meaningful regulation of this kind of spyware. But as the Pegasus project really laid bare, no one is safe. I mean, heads of state were persons of interest on the list. We weren't able to sort of definitively say whether or not they were really targeted, but Emmanuel Macron, Cyril Ramaphosa, Imran Khan, they were all on that list. So really, in order to tackle the issue at the root, we need regulation, and we need the very, very sort of highly invasive types of spyware to be banned.
I'll let Christian chime in here with a question.
Oh, thank you very much for that, Rasha. So my question is, what you late so when we first became aware of kind of like the pervasiveness of torture, and then the movement to torture light, and then tried to figure out, okay, how do we detect this? This just seems like it's a whole other level of the difficulty in terms of detection. And so this effort that you all put together seems historically unprecedented, right? The number of journalists, the number of different media organizations that came together. Is that now, can we now view that as kind of an infrastructure for discovery, or was that just kind of a historically unprecedented element? Because I'm thinking about like, so companies are going about their business, they're generating new technologies, people are getting paid, people are getting investigated. Every now and then someone will be like, hey, my phone. And so what I find interesting is trying to think of, kind of in line with Yousef's comment, or the question that we got, which is kind of like, how do we think about the counter to the developments that are taking place? And so if we can view the coalition of organizations as kind of part of an infrastructure, it's almost as if I want one of these like forensic elements to then make their pass through all educational institutions so everybody could be investigated, right? Like I first hear about this forensic stuff with some activists in some Oslo human rights organization, and they were doing these forensic evaluations there, and a bunch of the activists realized that, hey, my phone has got this too. And so I'm wondering about what we could do to develop a counterweight informational and active oriented dismantling effort. And so now you just introduced policy, right? I'm just like, oh yeah, we should try to block that too. So I'm curious about the counter transnational repression kind of like mobilization effort. Do you see that as cohering in different ways? And what do you think is like the most useful thing that could be done moving forward? Sorry, rambling nature, but yes.
No, that's such a great question, and I'm really glad you asked it. I think one of the most sort of gratifying, I guess, impacts of the Pegasus project was the building the ecosystem, right? Because I think before the Pegasus project, it was really mostly Citizen Lab and Amnesty Tech, to a much lesser extent than Citizen Lab, that was kind of carrying out this this kind of research. But since then, many more institutions are building that capacity. So Access Now, Access Now has also had a helpline as well, pre the Pegasus project. But they've sort of expanded their capacity now. Many other human rights organizations are building these kinds of teams within their organizations as well to start carrying out this research. I sit on the board of a fund called the Spyware Accountability Initiative, and that fund is designed precisely to sustain the ecosystem, be it through research, be it through advocacy work, through campaigning, through technical capacity, and it's really a much fast growing field. Again, I'd say maybe 2 years ago, the most of the capacity was in the sort of so-called global north, having the sort of the skills and the forensic ability to carry out these kinds of investigations. And since then, since the fund as well, we see a lot of that technical capacity being spread to other regions, particularly to South America, to countries in Africa, to Eastern Europe. Asia still remains a bit of a challenge. So definitely the ecosystem is being sustained and is growing. Amnesty International also launched a fellowship program when I was there. And the aim of the fellowship program, again, was to train researchers and equip them with the tools and the knowledge to be able to carry out this kind of research, to then also be able to train their own communities. And that fellowship program still exists, and it actually exists in Citizen Lab, as a similar one exists in Citizen Lab and others and other organizations. So yes, I think that was a very important outcome of the Pegasus project as well. And the ecosystem continues to grow and thrive. And just one final point I'd make is we're also seeing a lot more collaboration now between civil society and tech companies in ways that I couldn't have really imagined, because we're often sort of at odds with each other. But security teams in big tech companies collaborate very, very closely with these, forensic research, digital forensics researchers, in terms of sort of sharing information about vulnerabilities and patching them up as soon as they arise, sending out notifications when, if Amnesty or Citizen Lab identify a vulnerability, then they'll flag that to Apple or to Meta, and then Meta will send, notifications to their users. So a lot of that kind of collaboration and cross-fertilization has also been very, very helpful in sort of trying to get ahead of the attacks. But it's very difficult.
Thank you so much, Rasha. I know that you needed to step out early, so please do so whenever you need. I wanted to turn now to John, who's going to be talking to us about lawfare. And perhaps one of the questions that we received about when scholars or students are targeted is also relevant here. So John, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Yousef, and thank you to Transnational Repression Project for having the webinar on this important topic. I'm going to speak from this book that I've recently published with my colleagues Tena Prelets and Tom Main. It's called Indulging Kleptocracy, and it's about the professional service provision to persons with kleptocratic and oligarchic wealth, kleptocrats, oligarchs themselves typically, and how things like their assets are managed. They're able to acquire real estate. They might be able to acquire residencies and citizenships, and they engage in these kind of reputational activities as well, including around lawfare, defamation law, and the role of sort of private and corporate intelligence companies in supporting them. So I will kind of focus on that in a transnational repression context, and I think therefore it's quite important to think through how these actors are involved in that space. So I'm going to kind of address this question of how are private intelligence companies and defamation law firms involved in transnational repression. Those two things can be linked in the sense of thinking about reputation management, which is this kind of bigger sector involving a whole panoply of companies. And the kind of answer to that question is that these companies are engaged in legal and sometimes gray, quasi-legal business activities in this broader domain of reputation management on behalf of their clients, who may be from governments overseas, maybe in business. So I'll just say a few things about how we understand transnational repression, private intelligence as a sector as well, defamation law, a little bit on how those two are linked. And then I'll spend 5 minutes or so talking about a case from Kazakhstan that we've worked on and we cover in this book. So first of all, transnational repression. I directed something called the Central Asian Political Exiles Projects from 2014 to 2020. Ed, who will speak next, was involved in that a little bit too. And I think it's important to remember that when we talk about political exiles subject to transnational repression, we're thinking about everyone from, scholars, human rights activists who we may have more natural sympathy for, but a lot of the harder cases around former regime insiders and business people who've made a lot of money out of the place, which is doing the repression and were once part of the system themselves. So there's quite a range of actors involved. We developed in that project an escalatory model for understanding this, from a kind of through stage one, when a person might be targeted with some harassment, disinformation, possibly legal threats of various kinds, through a second stage focused on arrest, detention, that could be detaining assets as well as persons, and then an end game where assassination may be involved, rendition, deportation back to a home country. Non-state actors can be involved in all of these stages, including the reputation management business, black PR, legal threats around defamation, and private surveillance, being involved in being fed to the authorities so they can identify people who they may then be arrested, because very often state authorities in a third country will not be targeting their resources in that way. So private surveillance can be useful. And even at the third and most extreme stage, we see the role of non-state actors, at least in the form of organized crime. But I think if we focus on these earlier stages, there we see the involvement of private sector legal entities and this role of defamation law and more broadly private intelligence. So there's a formal legal contracting of those services, including in Western democracies. So when we talk about corporate and private intelligence, we're talking about an industry which is really hard to study. There's very few academic studies on it. While the precise scope of this industry is clear, London is certainly one of, if not the global capitals for it as an industry. And in 2017, there was an estimate that the corporate intelligence sector, and that's slightly different, but offering a series of business services, was worth around £19 billion, or about $25 billion a year. Private intel is also related to official intelligence services. We know there's lots of contracting out by the major intelligence services, including the US and the UK. The industry monitoring service, Intelligence Online, charts the very large numbers of former senior intelligence officials and ambassadors to the private sector. Former intelligence officers and security specialists might typically start some of these private intelligence consultancies. Former ambassadors are often finding their way into private offices or family offices, sometimes sovereign wealth funds and other investment arms of, say, Gulf monarchies. And a recent academic study based on the UK found that it was officials or former officials in the Ministry of Defence, the Cabinet Office and the Foreign Office that were the three government departments which were particularly prone to revolving door activity amongst senior civil servants. So a second sector we might be interested in is defamation law. So defamation law is a routine tool of defamation management. For example, since 2016, President Trump has brought more than 10 defamation lawsuits requesting $3.7 billion in damages against major news organizations. Defamation lawfare refers to the widespread yet vastly understudied transnational and domestic practice of defamation-based strategic lawsuits against public participation, or SLAPs, and that's against critics, including academics. These strategic lawsuits are increasingly weaponized by states and private individuals to censor opposition, activism, advocacy, and even peer-reviewed research in ways I think that remain underappreciated. Myself, my research team, two of our publications have been subject to these kinds of slaps, so I can have some personal experience of that myself. Defamation law is most commonly used transnationally from what we call globalizing authoritarian regimes whose elites have interests and assets to defend overseas. So these are kind of highly interdependent and hybrid regimes where government and private actors use defamation lawfare to contest their reputation and the way they're being presented overseas. Lots and lots of examples of this we could go on to. I'm just going to spend the last sort of 5 or 7 minutes of my presentation, I think that's about what I have, talking about a case from Kazakhstan. I'm happy to go into wider issues around defamation and maybe its targeting against research in the comments and questions if people wish. But just focusing on this case, which is the use of private intelligence and defamation lawfare together in the case of Mukhtar Ablyazov, who's a Kazakh former banker, opposition figure, who's been in exile since 2009 and has been targeted by Western private intelligence and law firms working on behalf of the Nazarbayev regime in Kazakhstan, which was in power and influential until very recently. Some of the lawful tactics which were used against Ablyazov and his associates by private sector actors, including extensive surveillance across Europe, carried out by Diligence, a London private security firm, as well as various threats directed at one of Ablyazov's lawyers by Patrick Robertson of World PR, a London-based and Panama-registered company. So sort of engaging in threatening behavior alongside PR. But the company that has been working for the Nazarbayev elite for the longest is, for over 15 years indeed, is Arcanum Global, which is a private intelligence agency based in Knightsbridge in London and founded in 2006 by Ron Waheed. Waheed is an American and donor to the Republican Party who claims to have considerable connections to the US intelligence services. Arcanum includes multiple ex-spies and former national security officials among its staff and on its board. The Ablyazov story itself is apparently never-ending. It's mainly a struggle over assets that Ablyazov has been found in courts to have stolen from Kazakhstan or to acquired illegally, and the recovery of those assets. In 2017, Ablyazov won his appeal against extradition back to Kazakhstan at the highest level in the French courts. He remains in France, but those cases are kind of ongoing. And there are many lawsuits that have just become, that have revolved around this case. Several of those relate to these contested assets, including at least two arising, and this is in the words of a US judge hearing one of these cases in 2019, from threatened or asserted claims against the individuals as identified by Arcanum. So what we have here is Arcanum identifying persons who hold assets, who have been involved in assets, and then them being kind of tracked down through the courts in these asset recovery cases. Now, some of these companies are a little bit shady, as we've just seen from the previous examples, and the Kazakh government has sought to disassociate itself from many of these. Marat Beketayev, who was Justice Minister of Kazakhstan and a former director of what became a sort of listed London company, Eurasian National Resources Corporation, commented, "Frankly, there were many people approaching us with such crazy proposals. The techniques on offer were disturbing. Arranging scandals, hacking emails, things like that. That is simply stupid. This works maybe for a short period of time, but in the long run, if you engage in such things, you will never be taken seriously by other countries." That was Beketayev speaking to the journalist Tom Burgess around 5 years ago. Beketayev has himself since been arrested in Kazakhstan and is awaiting trial on fraud and embezzlement charges after the political regime changed there 3 years ago. So notwithstanding Beketayev's own disclaimer, the political and business elite of Kazakhstan have formed an intimate professional relationship with Arcanum Global and its fight in the foreign courts against its enemies and former allies. So Felix Sater is a Russian-American property developer, convicted fraudster, and former Trump Organization business partner with the company Bayrock. He was contracted by Arcanum for this purpose. The Kazakh state and its private partners face ongoing court cases related to their use of Sater as an intelligent asset against the Ablyazov. So they charge Sater for breach of contract, for failing to deliver on what they hoped, but Sater in turn charges them with defamation. And it's telling that the Kazakh entities that are often named in these suits, which are around kind of asset recovery, are both the city of Almaty and BTA Bank, which is the bank that Ablyazov used to run and then switched ownership. So you've got a public and private institution working together, and that's what you often see in these cases. So the corporate intelligence industry as a whole, and Ron Waheed's London-based Arcanum Global in particular, also trade at this intersection of the public and the private, and that's what's key to understanding what's going on here. According to documents from the court cases from 2019 onwards, Sater was paid for his cooperation via a front company called Litco. So he got a $100,000 monthly fee and a 16% return on all assets recovered by the Kazakhs, by Almaty and BTA. And there was an ongoing kind of struggle over that and the contract. And what's important here was that had the lawyers involved, that's Boyce Schiller, an American law firm, known that Litco was owned by Sater and he was being paid as a witness, that would have been illegal under US law. So the role of the private intelligence company here was as a go-between to arrange that in order to give the law firm plausible deniability. So over 15 years, Waheed and his colleagues have become directly invested in the asset management of the Nazarbayev family and associates. Therefore, a protagonist in transnational repression against Ablyazov, we might say. In the summer of 2022, the UK arm of the US law firm Boyce Schiller, which is again the same firm that had almost got into trouble over arcane and paying their witnesses, with their witness Felix Sater, they took legal action on behalf of a holding company for the Nazarbayev elite against 4 UK media outlets that published a story about its assets. So this was a defamation claim against them. And the claim submitted by them was actually signed by a British politician called Lord David Evans, who was a member of the UK Parliament for the Labour Party, the governing Labour Party. So again, you've got British political and business figures that are involved in this. This is a form of transnational oppression where the actors involved are not shady sort of entities, but like formal political figures in some cases. So that's this suit alleged defamation in the reporting by these media organizations, including the Bureau of Investigative Journalists and the Daily Telegraph. And it sort of extends this kind of allegations widely, even targets the GoFundMe page that the investigative journalists used to try and fund their defense. So it sort of piled this on, and it sought to pass on fees or to acquire fees, including the fees that another company also owned by Waheed was contracting for reputation management. So there's a kind of like blurring here between sort of defamation law and the broader reputation management and private intelligence sector. I should say, because this is being recorded, that Arcanum denies that they are engaged in transnational repression. They explicitly did that to the journalist Tom Burgess. Waheed told Burgess, "It is absurd to assert that our work supports repression would mean you claim that the UK, French, Swiss, and US governments and laws are complicit with Kazakhstan's repression regime." So their defense here is that the laws in these countries in question are themselves, they're entirely compliant with those laws. And in most cases, I think that is correct. However, if we see, and just a few words of conclusion before I finish, I must be at time now, I apologize for that. But if we see transnational repression of political exiles in the context of asset management, reputation management for globalizing authoritarian regimes and against exiles like Ablyazov, we can see that these kind of respectable private sector companies and law firms in the West are very much part of it, and politicians too. Peter Mandelson, former UK government minister, now UK ambassador to the United States, advised ENRC, this Kazakh company, on its business strategy around 2012 to 2030, when it was considering delisting from the London Stock Exchange and facing a major fraud investigation that went on for years in the UK. Tony Blair took a lucrative contract to advise President Nazarbayev at that time on managing the reputation of himself and his country after his security forces killed unarmed protesters in 2011. So in short, transnational repression in this area of sort of defamation lawfare and private intelligence is part of these wider political and business networks, which involve professional services, elite firms, and indeed major political figures. So I'll stop at that. And as I say, happy to take questions around the whole topic and on a variety of stuff.
Thank you so much for that, John. Really fascinating kind of window into these different networks and the overlaps there. We'll save questions for both of you once Edward concludes. And I want to turn it over to Edward now, who I know is going to talk to us a little bit about the role of Interpol.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. Thank you, Yousef. It's a great pleasure to be here talking about this very important topic. Interpol was created in 1923 as the International Criminal Police Commission, renamed and rebranded as Interpol after it was reformed after having been taken over by Nazi Germany during the interwar and World War II period, and reformed in 1956 with a new constitution and a new name that we now know it as Interpol. It's one of the largest international organizations in the world, made up of 196 different member states. And contrary to Hollywood and Netflix, it doesn't have agents. There aren't Interpol agents going around the world pursuing opponents and arresting them and taking them back to different countries. Instead, it's more of a, Ted Broman's described as a sophisticated electronic bulletin board where the 196 police forces around the world can share information. So strictly speaking, in many ways, it's a platform for states to enact transnational repression rather than really being a non-state actor in and of itself. But ultimately, Interpol has facilitated a lot of the transnational repression that we've seen in recent years, despite the fact that by its constitution and by its rules, it is explicitly not supposed to be used for politically motivated purposes. Of course, authoritarian regimes find ways to get around this by accusing individuals of fraud, of molesting children, of pornography and other crimes that are considered ordinary law and are considered crimes that states can pursue individuals through Interpol. The main tools for transnational repression are red notices and diffusions. These are not arrest warrants. So again, they do not oblige any country to detain someone and to extradite them, but they are a request for their arrest pending a extradition process. And so ultimately, red notices are more formal. They go through more oversight by Interpol, by Interpol's secretariat that is based in Lyon in France. And diffusions are less formal, quicker. They're intended for ultimately for governments to rapidly inform police forces around the world that an individual has left their country and is wanted. But ultimately, it's effectively like you have all of the email addresses of the police forces in 196 different countries, and you just click and you send all, stating which person needs to be arrested, some biographical details, some details about what crime they are accused of. And then the idea is that they detain those individuals. Again, initially, this is, of course, intended to be pursuing drug traffickers and terrorists and individuals who have fled different jurisdictions and are wanted for crimes. But of course, authoritarian regimes have been using it to target the kind of individuals that we've been discussing so far: journalists, human rights activists, opposition politicians, and various other individuals who shouldn't be being pursued through Interpol. We've seen an explosion in the number of red notices and diffusions in recent years. If you go on the website of Interpol, I did that this morning to check the latest figure, there are 6,575 red notices that are public, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. The true number of red notices isn't known, and that's one of the problems I'm going to come to with Interpol. It's lack of transparency. We don't really know the number of red notices that are in circulation. We don't know the numbers of diffusions in circulation. The last time Interpol released data that I could find on this was back in 2018, when we had more than 100,000 diffusions and over 60,000 red notices that were currently in circulation at that time. That is a massive increase from 20 years ago, 2002, when there were just 1,200 red notices in circulation. So over the course of 18 years, it went from, 16 years, in fact, it went from 1,200 red notices in circulation to 60,000 red notices in circulation. What explains this increase? Partially, it's Interpol's own adaptation to the 21st century, moving in 2002 to an electronic system. Before, you had to physically mail red notices to different countries around the world, which could take 4 to 6 months to appear in their databases. Now, you can obviously do it since 2002 instantaneously. So that's one of the major developments that's led to Interpol becoming much more vulnerable to abuse by authoritarian regimes. And second, we've seen, of course, the rise of authoritarian powers, such as China, Russia, and Turkey. We've seen domestic developments in those countries, such as Xi Jinping coming to power in 2013 and cracking down on Xinjiang, on the Uyghur population, on Hong Kong, launching a global anti-corruption campaign, all of which has been aided through Interpol. Russia, of course, has pursued its war of aggression on Ukraine and pushed many people out of the country who have then been pursued through Interpol, and Turkey, particularly after 2016 and its alleged coup attempt against the Gulen movement. It attempted to have over 60,000 diffusions published through Interpol unsuccessfully. They were blocked, but ultimately it still managed to pursue various individuals through Interpol, including various members of the opposition. And so for these reasons, we're seeing Interpol increasingly being used by authoritarian regimes. And Interpol has a number of key weaknesses that I think make it vulnerable. I think the two most noteworthy ones are sovereign equality, this principle that all the states are treated equally, that a red notice, an arrest request issued by Russia is the same as an arrest request issued by the UK or Switzerland, that ultimately there's a principle that all the justice systems are the same, and instead of what is the norm in the criminal justice system, right, that you are innocent until you're proven guilty, and the burden of proof lies with the accuser. In this case, it's the opposite. Right? Ultimately, regimes can publish accusations with very limited proof, and it falls upon the individual who's been accused to prove their innocence. They're not innocent until proven guilty. They have the burden of proving that these are false allegations, that they're innocent, and that they should be removed from this system. So that's the first key weakness of Interpol. I think the second that I've already alluded to is this lack of transparency. There have been various cases within the context of Central Asia, where much of my research focuses, where people don't even know they're on an Interpol red notice list until they appear at an airport and they're detained. And they are told at that time that they're on it, have an Interpol red notice. As I said, there are 6,500 Interpol red notices that are active and online, and you can search for those, but there are many, many tens of thousands more that exist. And ultimately, people don't often know about it until they are detained. Interpol doesn't publish data, as I said, on the number of red notices or diffusions in circulation, doesn't publish data on the number of countries that have been accused of abuse, or the number of countries that have had red notices, requests to delete their red notices from individuals who've accused them of pursuing them through politically motivated reasons and purposes. So there's a lack of transparency. There's also a great degree of authoritarian influence within the organization. The UAE in particular has been very keen to curry favor and buy influence within Interpol. It spent over donated $54 million in 2017, for example, much of it channeled through a foundation, the Interpol Foundation for a Safer World, that was subsequently disbanded. But ultimately, it was one way that they tried to buy influence within this organization. And the head of, the president of Interpol, who's the kind of figurehead of the organization since 2021, has been the former Deputy Minister of Internal Affairs of the UAE, which is Ahmed Nasser al-Raisi, an individual who's been accused of enacting transnational repression himself, and of course torturing various dissidents within that country. So we have someone who has credible allegations of human rights and abuses and torture as the head of this global policing organization. So to a great degree, these kind of authoritarian actors are playing a key role in shaping and creating a conducive environment within the organization. Fourth, there's a lack of oversight. It's an organization that prioritizes efficiency and speed, as I said, over checking and having the ability to check whether red notices are genuine or not. There's obviously a culture of law enforcement mentality pervades this organization. And fifth, there's a limited capacity, right? As tens of thousands of red notices are being issued, it's very difficult for them to check whether they are genuine or not. What effects does this have? Obviously, the most extreme effect is one is detained and then extradited to another country. In many cases, people are detained for many years. Earlier this year in February, an Uyghur who was arrested in Morocco back in 2021 was released, Idris Hassan, but he'd spent 43 months in prison effectively, based on an arrest warrant or an arrest request through Interpol issued by China purely because he's part of an ethnic minority group that Xi Jinping is attempting to effectively eradicate. In other cases, the case of Ahmed Jafar Muhammad Ali, a Bahraini opposition politician who arrived in Serbia in 2021 to ask for asylum and was rapidly arrested upon arrival in the country through a red notice, and shortly afterwards extradited on a private plane back to the UAE, and where he still languishes in prison, with reports of him being denied medical treatment, beaten, kept in solitary confinement, and he's in fact lodged a criminal case against Interpol for facilitating his return to that country. So that's the most extreme examples, of course, but in many cases it's more about harassing and making the lives of exiles, particularly in Europe, who fled to countries where red notices aren't considered to be grounds for extradition. It makes it difficult to open a bank account. It makes it people fail background checks, and ultimately they're delegitimized. This myth of Interpol having agents and Interpol being a global community of 196 different police forces, a lot of the reporting in Turkey and in China and in Central Asia and in Russia says these people are wanted by Interpol, right? And so there's an agreement that all the countries in the world consider them a terrorist or consider them a criminal and that they should be returned. And so really it delegitimizes a lot of these individuals. Just briefly, as I'm coming up on time, there have been reform efforts within Interpol, many of them spearheaded here in the United States, where we had the passing of the TRAP Act in 2021, which is the first dedicated legislation focused on transnational repression. And Interpol played a key role in this legislation that was bipartisan. It requires the executive branch to file periodic reports on its efforts to stem abuse. It's published at least 3 of these so far, many of them not quite meeting the requirements of the law. It requires the United States to promote reforms within Interpol, and it makes clear that a red notice is not sufficient for someone to be detained. Before, we'd had various cases of ICE detaining individuals based on red notices from countries like Russia and Kazakhstan, and then being kept in pretrial detention for years at a time, purely based on a red notice. It's now made that clear that that is not sufficient. It's not enough just to have a red notice from a country. You need much more proof. Interpol itself has adopted various reforms, most importantly starting in 2017 as a result of a lot of international pressure from scholars, from organizations like Amnesty International and Fair Trials International and others who are pushing for these reforms. And the body that's in charge of the oversight of and the issuing of red notices, the Committee for the Control of Interpol's Files, was expanded, given timeframes with which it had to conduct its works. It was often very slow, and ultimately, in 2017, also a refugee policy was issued. If you have refugee status in the country or a political asylum, you can petition to have your red notice removed. They created a notices and diffusions task force, which is supposed to screen red notices before publication, ultimately giving a little bit more oversight. And they've staffed that with a slightly larger staff and a larger budget. And they've ended private donations and are no longer accepting money from the UAE's foundation that it was really using to try and influence the organization. So some progress has been made, but there's still many problems remain. And I'll just wrap up with a few kind of ideas that emerged from my research and others on what could be done about this. First, Interpol needs to be more transparent, right? It doesn't publish detailed statistics on red notices or diffusions, how many exist, who's requesting them, how many are being deleted, which countries are being accused of abuse most frequently. This would promote accountability within the organization. Even though the CCF that oversees all of this kind of issuing of red notices has increased its budget and resources, even more resources and staffing could help it improve its transparency, improve its efficiency, and ultimately allow it to address abuse. A more nuclear option is to suspend countries that serially abuse Interpol. This has been done before. The Assad regime was removed from Interpol in 2011, shortly after the outbreak of the Syrian civil war. And so there are mechanisms, there are rules, and there are means in which countries could be suspended, such as Russia, such as Turkey or others, from Interpol for serially abusing it. And I think to push for this, there's a need for, and this is part of the TRAP Act's commitment for democratic countries, for Europe, the United States, to push for these reforms within the General Assembly of Interpol. But it's a big topic. I'm happy to answer any questions and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much for that, Edward. I do want to invite now all of our attendees to send in any questions that they may have. One of the reasons that we wanted to focus on this topic is because we feel that transnational repression perpetrated by states is often more straightforward, more easy to understand. When a government sends goons from its intelligence agency overseas to effectively liquidate a dissident, it's easy to understand what that is and how it's playing out and who's responsible and so on. But there is this grayer area where non-state actors are involved. And as you noted, John, in the case that you highlighted with the various connections and different actors and methods that were being used, some legal, some quasi-legal, some playing out in the public sphere. There is a different story that can be told, and the firm that you noted, said, "Hey, we're just following the law. We're just operating within the bounds of what is legal." But the reality is, these efforts are clearly aimed at coercing and intimidating a specific individual. How, when there is this gray area, when we're not talking about state agents carrying out targeted assassinations of dissidents in a different country, how do we clearly sort of navigate these things when there is this plausible deniability that many of these actors will rely on hiding behind?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a way, the case that I covered kind of looked at both the prosecution of transnational repression or something like that by private intelligence firms and defamation lawyers and law firms actually that engage in other areas. It's all kind of connected. So you got that on the one hand, then you have the journalists exposing it. And what the journalists are essentially saying is that these corporate intelligence and law firms that have been working for regimes targeting their exiles overseas for a very long time, contracts of multiple decades effectively being renewed, have a relationship to the regime which is doing the transnational repression, which is something other than a simple formal contractual relationship. It's what in political science we call a clientelistic relationship. And you can see that in terms of that they themselves end up being directors of holding companies and therefore having this vested economic interest in the assets that are being tried to be recovered from exiles. The difficulty is that this case, and particularly the Ablazov case that I covered, if you're looking around for like some hero or good guy, you're not going to find it because, there was a lot of theft. And so we're not talking here about the use of corporate intelligence and defamation lawfare against a, straight out good guy. That being said, we know that some of these firms are also used against journalists and even academics to, as I mentioned, we've been subject to this. The journalist Tom Burgess, who I mentioned, was actually followed around London by private intelligence professionals, and then talked later about having to use techniques that he'd learned in Nigeria, a sort of counter surveillance in order to do his work in London. So we know that journalists like him were being targeted by essentially the same kinds of companies. And Burgess also was accused of defamation for his book Kleptopia, which reported on much of this. So they are used against kind of figures that we would say, well, that's illegitimate. And you can use legal methods, you can report on it. Burgess used the Parliamentary Select Committee to speak about how he was being surveilled by these companies. Ultimately, HarperCollins, his publisher, won in court against the Kazakh company that charged him. So there are ways to like officially push back, and that still works in rule of law jurisdictions. But this kind of murky world where you've got a Blazov against a Nazarbayev in Kazakhstan, you know, a kleptocrat against someone who has been found to have stolen lots. It's you know, the most important thing is just that we know about it. But even making it known as an academic or a journalist comes with certain kinds of risks, as we saw.
Thank you for that, John. Other questions? So
I actually have one for Ed, if
go ahead.
yeah, which is, I don't know if you saw recently, Ed, but there was a by invitation piece in The Economist by Ben Keefe and his colleague. I know Ben quite well. Yeah, I don't know if you've met him, but he's a barrister working in this area. And one of the things he suggested about Interpol is to have a system like the Financial Action Task Force systems of a kind of grey listing countries that are kind of basically not compliant with the rules of the organization. I wasn't sure about that suggestion because FATF has many of the same problems of Interpol, and its grey listing system is widely regarded as kind of ridiculous by people who work in this field because it just ends up targeting small island states that don't have the regulatory capacity to deal with financial crime. But nevertheless, the idea that you should have that kind of system where the serial abusers of Interpol are essentially named and shamed. I wondered what you thought of that.
Yeah, I think it's certainly, and they did do this. There's one time, I'm forgetting when it was in like the mid 2000s, that they did, for one time, they published like some data that indicated which countries were the most abusive. Turkey was up there, and Iran and Paris. It was the kind of usual suspects. But since then, probably because of the backlash they received from those countries, they haven't done so. I think this principle of sovereign equality makes it very difficult to imagine that's going to happen when you have the president of the organization, you know, as someone who was himself very much involved in much of this abuse. You know, it's difficult to imagine that would the countries, would there be enough votes in the General Assembly to pass that kind of legislation, pass that kind of rule change that would obviously embarrass certain members. I think they've shied away from and kind of stuck hidden behind that principle of sovereign equality that, you know, to, you know, prevent this kind of policy ever being enacted. So I think whilst I think it would be useful to at least publish a report that could, at least, it would name and shame, but it maybe wouldn't be quite as aggressive as grey listing them. But I think at least having a report that was a report of how many red notices are published, how many divisions are published, who is refuting them, you know, which countries are subject to the most complaints effectively. That would be, I think, a good start. And it has been done before. And that maybe wouldn't really require, as far as I could tell, and I mean, I'm not a lawyer, and so there are others who could maybe answer this question better than I could. I don't think it will require any change to Interpol's rules. That could be something that will be published by the CCF, because that's the body that deals with that, with those requests and reviews them effectively. So yeah, I think that for me is the more feasible step that I think would be a desirable thing.
So we have a couple of questions in our queue here. One from an anonymous attendee asks, and either Edward or John, feel free to chime in here. What are the advantages or challenges of holding non-state actors accountable for transnational repression?
Yeah, we talked a little bit about them already, where I think, you know, it's a very shady, murky world. It's, you know, you've got litigation, you've got counter litigation. So, and you're dealing with, you know, law firms, and the thing that law firms hate most of all is being accused of engaging in illegality themselves or something close to that. So, in the case I mentioned where you had the paying of a witness by a third party, it was the judge commented on that, and that came pretty close to the real evidence that the law firm itself may have been witting and therefore engaging in criminal behavior. So these are cases where there's an endless stream of income for them, so they're really invested in them. These are figures where you're talking about billions of dollars worth of assets. The legal cases will be struggling. There'll be struggles. They'll be ongoing for a very long period of time. So I think the cost is huge and the stakes are so high. So they're where you've got the challenges of doing it. On the other hand, I won't go into detail, but as academics work in this space, you can be contracted as expert witnesses on the other side of this to expose these kinds of networks. So my team's been involved in that on one of these cases, and it's absolutely fascinating. It's not that much work on our part to be involved in that and exposing that. There's a minimal fee sometimes involved, so it's not free labor either. But it's something I think that it's increasingly important for sort of regional experts to get involved. This is the real business of politics, right? I personally, I feel, for example, if you want to understand politics in Kazakhstan, study this. Don't study elections in Kazakhstan. And so I think there needs to be a shift amongst, and you see this, and it's often led actually by local civil society and activists, including those who have moved overseas and gone into exile themselves. That's the opportunity, I guess, or the advantage, that they're bringing these cases forward. People like me work transnationally with them. They're highlighting cases. They're bringing documents to the attention of researchers and journalists. And there's a kind of transnational working out and a response to all of this. So it's a series of sort of cluttered comments on that, but I'd be interested to know what Ed thought about it too. And I know there's another question on Ablyazov, which I'm happy to come to later.
Yeah, I think as you said, and we didn't mention another non-state actor that we could have had a panelist speak on, which is organized criminal networks, right? And the way in which states in Central Asia, Venezuela, all around the world have used organized criminal networks for the very reason that they are non-state, right? And there's plausible deniability, right, in using them. And I think this is what makes tackling the non-state actors very, very difficult, because at the same time, a lot of what the kind of Rice's presentation on kind of Finn Fisher and some of those technology companies, many of the countries would claim, this is legitimate intelligence gathering, right? This is legitimate counterterrorism and so on and so forth, right? They kind of use that as the smokescreen to say, this is how we're justifying this. And then from the company's perspective, there's a kind of, well, we produce the technology and we transfer it, and then we're not responsible for how it's used or who it's used against. And so, yeah, it does complicate matters. But I think it's important. It's important that we have this conversation and that we think of transnational repression beyond being a form of state repression, right? It is transnational, and it does involve all sorts of different stakeholders and actors, both public and private.
Thanks for that, Edward. And John, if you want to just touch on Grady's question in closing, and then we'll sort of wrap up. And the question there is, how often do targeted individuals with enough resources hire their own private intelligence agents to counter these sorts of campaigns, specifically asking about Ablyazov himself?
Yes. So when we're talking about these super elite former insiders, billionaires themselves, at least Ablyazov once did have that level of assets, then yes, absolutely, they do exactly the same. And that is part of the kind of moral and political complexity of this. Not only did Ablyazov operate in a very similar fashion, he had a family office really with kind of lawyers and financial experts on the inside too. But he also tried to contract Arcanum Global, the very same firm that was working for the Nazarbayev regime. In fact, there's a piece by Tom Burgess, who was mentioned earlier, where he talks about that. And Arcanum say, well, we never considered working for him, but yeah, we took the meeting because it was useful for our client. So this is the kind of shady world that they kind of work in, where they can kind of intimate that they're playing both sides, they can flip. And in the world of business, private intelligence, corporate intelligence, it has that internecine aspect where there's occasional side switching, and essentially, I mean, forgive my cynicism, but this is how capitalism generally works, right? You make money on the sale, and you make money on going after it. You make money on hiding the asset. You make money on recovering it, and so that's how the industry operates. It is of that type. So I don't think we should be surprised when it comes to this very elite level. That's how it's operating, and that also obviously comes with kinds of conflicts of interest, which are at a minimum ethically troubling, including to some of the professional bodies who are supervising these groups. Private intelligence, relatively unregulated. Law, obviously, is highly regulated. So that's partly why I think you get these partnerships, like the one with the paying and a witness, because you can farm out the difficult stuff you need to do into a sector which is relatively unregulated. And that again is standard business practice for large companies. They'll go out to boutique firms to do high risk activities. So yes, it's done by both sides, and it's done in these rather dubious and clandestine ways. But for us, it's about spotting the patterns, spotting, I suppose, the kind of duel that's taking place, the mimicry almost between the two sides as they struggle over assets. So I know that takes us a little bit away from transnational repression. But I think you can see even the Iglesias case as an instance of transnational repression, certainly against the political exile. But then more to the point, look at what's happening to the journalists and even some academics who are involved in reporting on that. They are certainly being subject to transnational repression.
Thanks so much, John. And I just want to take this moment to thank all of you who participated today in this webinar, sharing your insights. For everyone who tuned in and asked questions, we really, really appreciate it, and are grateful to better understand a little bit about the role of non-state actors in transnational repression. Please stay tuned to future programming from the Transnational Repression Project, and be well.